The city lights of New York flickered against the darkness, but even the brightest neon could not illuminate the shadow of a man who once ruled the underworld with an iron fist. Lucky Luciano, the legendary architect of organized crime, now walked through his final years in exile, far from the streets where his name had inspired fear and admiration alike. He was a king without a kingdom, a man whose empire had sprawled across cities and oceans, reduced to memories whispered in smoky backrooms and archived in police files. The contrast was striking. Once he had controlled gambling rings, unions, and illicit trades with near-absolute precision. Now he existed as a ghost of his former self, moving through quiet Italian towns under the watchful eyes of the authorities, carrying with him a lifetime of secrets, betrayals, and hard-won power. To understand this twilight of his life, one must first grasp the weight of the legend he had become. Lucky Luciano was more than a criminal. He was a strategist, a visionary, and a master of manipulation. He reshaped the Mafia not merely by brute force, but by organizing crime with a business-like efficiency that had never been seen before in America. Alliances were formed not just out of loyalty, but out of strategic necessity. Rivalries were not simply fought with guns, but with influence, intimidation, and psychological maneuvering. Every move Luciano made was calculated, yet even the sharpest mind could not escape the eventual consequences of ambition unchecked. Now, decades later, that same mind wrestled with solitude. Away from the bustling streets of Manhattan and the shadowed corridors of power, Luciano's world had shrunk to the narrow limits of his exile. His entourage was gone, many old allies either dead, imprisoned, or turned against him. Friends had become strangers, rivals had become historians. He lived surrounded by reminders of a life once filled with danger, excitement, and unparalleled authority, now replaced with quiet reflection and the faint hum of a life lived largely in secret. There was a subtle cruelty in this twilight. The man who had orchestrated chaos with precision was now powerless against the relentless march of time and the law. Yet even in this diminished existence, the aura of Luciano lingered. Stories of his exploits traveled faster than the man himself, carried by journalists, former associates, and government files. Each tale emphasized the duality that had defined him: the brilliance and the ruthlessness, the loyalty he demanded and the fear he inspired. To the world, he remained an icon of criminal genius, a figure larger than life, but privately, Luciano confronted the emptiness that power could not fill. The psychological burden of his choices, the lives ended, the betrayals enacted, the empire built on both loyalty and fear, pressed down on him with an intensity that no freedom could alleviate. The cinematic irony of his final years is undeniable. A man who had once been untouchable, whose influence had reached from New York to Havana, now moved quietly, avoiding attention, living in a sort of carefully monitored exile. The streets he once controlled with a subtle nod or a whispered command were now ruled by others, men whose names he may have even helped elevate, only to watch them surpass and perhaps forget him. The contrast between past and present, between the myth and the man, sets the tone for this story. Power is transient, loyalty is fragile, and even the cleverest mind is vulnerable to the forces of history, law, and mortality. In these opening moments, the audience is invited to step into the mind of a man at the end of his journey, to witness the tension between legend and reality, between the memory of command and the reality of solitude. Luciano's life, once a canvas painted with daring ambition, now displays the muted colors of reflection and consequence. The story ahead will trace the journey of a man who conquered the criminal world, who navigated loyalty and betrayal with unmatched skill, and who, despite all, could not escape the inexorable shadows of his own making. This is the tale of the King of Nothing, and it begins here, in the quiet, unassuming dusk of a life that once blazed with notoriety, power, and an almost cinematic intensity. Before Lucky Luciano rose to power, the world of organized crime in America was a fractured, chaotic landscape. The streets of New York were a battleground of gangs, each vying for territory, influence, and survival. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other immigrant groups ran their own rackets, often clashing violently over control of gambling dens, extortion schemes, and illicit liquor during Prohibition. There was no unifying structure, no overarching authority to enforce rules, and no system to mitigate the endless cycles of revenge killings that left bodies in alleyways and newspapers splashed with headlines of horror. The criminal world was, in many ways, a mirror of the broader immigrant struggle, raw, desperate, and marked by survival of the fittest. Amid this chaos, the contrast with what would later become Luciano's empire is stark. Before his ascendancy, power was scattered, fleeting, and heavily dependent on brute force. Gangs operated like independent warlords, their authority constantly contested, their survival uncertain. The psychological toll of this environment was immense. Loyalty was fragile, alliances were temporary, and betrayal was often lethal. For ambitious figures like Luciano, the disorder presented both a threat and an opportunity. The streets were perilous, but they were also a blank canvas upon which a strategist could paint something entirely new. The emotional undercurrent of this era cannot be understated. For those living in the shadow of organized crime, the city was both vibrant and terrifying. On the surface, nightclubs glittered with the promise of excitement, and speakeasies thrived with music, liquor, and laughter. Beneath that glamour, fear simmered. Murders could happen without warning, and the law often seemed powerless or corrupt, turning a blind eye to those who could afford the right bribes. This duality, allure and danger, opportunity and death, created a psychological pressure cooker, one that shaped the ambitions and moral compromises of every emerging figure. Luciano absorbed this environment with the instincts of a predator, learning not only to navigate it but to dominate it. The fractured nature of crime also created a unique landscape for alliances and betrayals. Before the so-called Mafia families were organized under a national network, rival gangs constantly tested each other's strength. One day's ally could be the next day's assassin. This instability meant that survival was as much about strategy and foresight as it was about violence. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to perceive patterns that others could not see, to understand the underlying dynamics of fear, loyalty, and opportunity that governed the underworld. Where others relied on muscle and intimidation alone, he sought systems, structures, and rules. He envisioned a world where chaos could be tamed, and profit could be maximized without the constant threat of internal collapse. The societal context of the time further accentuated the rise of figures like Luciano. America in the early 20th century was a land of immigrants carving out identities in crowded, often hostile cities. Economic opportunity was scarce and discrimination was rampant. Many turned to crime not only for wealth but for power, respect, and survival. The streets themselves were a school, teaching lessons in negotiation, intimidation, and adaptation. Luciano emerged from this crucible, absorbing not only the technical knowledge of crime but also the psychological acuity to read people, manipulate situations, and anticipate threats. His rise would not have been possible without this chaotic backdrop, for it provided both the challenges to overcome and the lessons to master. This era also sets the stage for the psychological contrast that would define Luciano's later years. Witnessing the fragility of power and the ruthlessness of betrayal instilled in him a deep understanding of human nature, the hunger for dominance, the ease of deception, and the fragility of loyalty. The streets taught him that survival was not merely a physical contest but a mental and emotional one. Every handshake, every agreement, carried the weight of potential treachery. This awareness would later manifest in his ability to manipulate allies and rivals alike, maintaining control not through fear alone but through an intricate web of relationships and calculated influence. In essence, the world before Luciano was one of volatility and unpredictability. It was a place where ambition could be extinguished in a single night, where alliances shifted like sand, and where survival demanded not just strength but vision. For the future king of organized crime, this chaotic landscape was both a proving ground and an inspiration. It was here that the seeds of his strategy were planted, where he learned the rules of loyalty, fear, and power, and where he understood, perhaps instinctively, that true dominance required something more than raw aggression. By framing the disorder of this era, the audience gains a deeper appreciation of Luciano's later genius. His rise was not merely the story of a criminal climbing ranks, it was the transformation of chaos into order, of fragmented violence into structured enterprise. It was the emergence of a man who could see beyond the immediate, beyond the gunfire and the bloodshed, to envision a system that could endure. And it is against this backdrop of fractured crime, desperation, and peril that Luciano's legend begins to take shape. The story of a street kid who would become the architect of a criminal empire unlike any the world had seen. Born into the crowded tenements of Cicely Street in New York's Lower East Side, Charles Lucky Luciano entered a world defined by hardship, survival, and ambition before he even understood the word itself. The streets were his first school, and its lessons were unforgiving. Immigrant families like his navigated poverty, overcrowding, and a society that often looked upon them with suspicion and disdain. Violence was as common as bread, and respect was currency more valuable than money. Young Charles absorbed these lessons instinctively. He learned to read faces, anticipate danger, and seize opportunity before others even recognized it existed. In this chaotic urban crucible, the foundations of a future crime lord were quietly being forged. Luciano's early life was a mixture of fear and fascination. He witnessed the daily struggle of his parents and neighbors, but he also saw the informal hierarchies of the street, the older boys who commanded respect through cunning, speed, or sheer audacity. It was in these alleyways, behind the shopfronts and tenement doors, that he first tasted power, though he did not yet call it that. Running errands, collecting debts, and sometimes acting as a messenger for local gangs, he learned the small ways influence could be wielded. Every corner held a lesson. Betrayal could be sudden, loyalty fleeting, and violence both necessary and inevitable. Teenage Charles was not the largest or the strongest, but he was sharp, quick, and, above all, fearless. His moniker Lucky did not arrive by chance. It was a recognition of his uncanny ability to survive situations that would have destroyed others. Early scrapes with the law and narrow escapes from street fights contributed to the myth of his resilience. Yet his luck was more than chance. It was intelligence, timing, and an almost instinctual understanding of human behavior. He could size up a person in a glance, anticipate an adversary's move, and manipulate circumstances to his favor. These early skills would later underpin his ability to control men twice his age and navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime. By the time he entered his late teens, Luciano's ambition had crystallized. Unlike many of his peers, he did not aspire merely to survive or to dominate a single block. He envisioned something larger, something systematic. The Lower East Side was his first canvas, but he imagined a city, an empire. His first serious affiliations were with local gangs, where he learned the basics of enforcement, extortion, and protection rackets. Yet unlike many young hoodlums, Luciano was not content with brute force alone. He observed patterns, understood power structures, and recognized the fragility of alliances built solely on fear. He began cultivating relationships, not just through intimidation, but through trust, shared interest, and strategic necessity, laying the groundwork for the network he would later command. Luciano's formative years were also marked by moments of moral flexibility that hinted at the cold pragmatism to come. He witnessed the consequences of disloyalty, friends and rivals alike falling victim to retaliation, and he internalized a lesson that would guide him throughout life. Loyalty must be earned, fear must be managed, and power is never given freely. Each encounter, each small victory, reinforced the belief that control over others required both calculation and courage. The streets did not reward sentiment, they rewarded effectiveness. In this environment, Luciano's combination of intelligence, audacity, and charm became his most valuable assets. The psychological dimension of his rise cannot be overstated. Luciano developed a keen understanding of human nature early on, the ways envy, ambition, desire, and fear could be manipulated to achieve one's ends. He observed older gang leaders and saw not just their victories, but also their vulnerabilities. While others relied on intimidation or violence alone, Luciano learned that the mind could be more powerful than the gun. He honed the ability to persuade, negotiate, and strategize, using these skills to consolidate influence incrementally. By adolescence, he was already moving beyond mere survival. He was building leverage, positioning himself as a figure others would follow, either out of respect or necessity. Another key factor in Luciano's early development was his exposure to corruption and the blurred lines between legality and crime. Police officers could be bribed, politicians could be influenced, and businesses could be coerced. These realizations fueled a vision of organized crime not as scattered lawlessness but as a structured enterprise capable of generating immense profit and control. Even as a young man, Luciano imagined crime as a system rather than random acts of violence, a revolutionary perspective that set him apart from his contemporaries. The emotional landscape of these years is crucial to understanding his psyche. Ambition mingled with survival instinct. Fear coexisted with audacious risk-taking. Luciano learned early that power came not from brute force alone but from psychological mastery, reading intentions, predicting reactions, and exploiting opportunities. The streets demanded both ruthlessness and intelligence, and he possessed both in equal measure. These experiences shaped a man who would later transform the very nature of organized crime, blending strategy, diplomacy, and fear into a lethal formula that few could resist. By the early 1920s, Luciano had transitioned from street-level enforcer to rising star in the criminal underworld. He had earned the respect of older mobsters and demonstrated a unique capacity to mediate disputes, orchestrate operations, and recognize talent in others. His ascent was rapid because he combined qualities rarely found in combination: courage, intellect, adaptability, and a visionary understanding of power dynamics. While other gangsters fought turf wars and short-term bursts, Luciano thought in terms of empires, systems, and long-term influence. The rise of Lucky Luciano, from a scrappy street kid to a strategist on the brink of empire, is not merely a story of crime. It is a story of intellect meeting opportunity, of instinct and calculation merging to create dominance. It is the first act in a saga of power, loyalty, and eventual isolation, the psychological blueprint for a man who would command fear and respect in equal measure, yet ultimately confront the limitations of even his extraordinary genius. The streets that had shaped him, which had taught him the duality of loyalty and betrayal, the fragility of life and the mechanics of power, were now a distant memory, replaced by ambitions that would reach far beyond the Lower East Side. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved far beyond the narrow alleys and tenements of his youth. He had survived the chaos of the streets, outmaneuvered rivals, and earned the respect and fear of older gangsters. But surviving was no longer enough. Luciano's vision was broader, more audacious. He sought not just to dominate a neighborhood, but to redefine the very structure of organized crime in America. Where others relied on fragmented violence and fleeting alliances, he imagined an empire organized like a business, complete with hierarchy, discipline, and strategic oversight. This was revolutionary, and it would reshape the underworld for generations. The first step in building his empire was understanding the power of alliances. Luciano recognized early that domination required more than force. It demanded cooperation, negotiation, and the careful balancing of egos. He cultivated relationships with influential figures across ethnic lines, bridging Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs, forging a network that few had dared to imagine. By uniting disparate groups under common interests, Luciano transformed conflict into coordination. These alliances were not fragile friendships but pragmatic agreements, designed to maximize profit while minimizing destructive competition. He understood that a gang's strength was measured not by its capacity for violence alone but by its ability to maintain stability and orchestrate complex operations. Central to his strategy was the idea of the modern mafia family. Unlike the chaotic gangs of his youth, Luciano's organization was hierarchical and disciplined. He instituted clear roles: capo regimes overseeing crews, soldiers executing tasks, and associates operating in the shadows. Each member knew their responsibilities, and each decision served the collective enterprise. Loyalty was not only expected but enforced through a combination of respect, fear, and shared interest. Violations were met with swift consequences. Successes were rewarded strategically to reinforce commitment. Through this structure, Luciano transformed violence into leverage, chaos into profit, and individual ambition into collective purpose. Luciano also revolutionized the economics of crime. He approached illegal enterprises with a business-minded rigor previously unseen in the underworld. Gambling operations, prostitution rings, bootlegging during Prohibition, labor rackets, and narcotics were no longer isolated ventures. They were coordinated streams of income, carefully managed for efficiency and secrecy. Luciano understood supply and demand, risk and reward, and the value of controlling distribution channels. Unlike many mobsters who relied on intimidation alone, he relied on organization, discipline, and foresight, creating a model that blurred the line between criminality and corporate management. Perhaps most crucial to his empire building was Luciano's mastery of psychology and perception. He knew that fear could command obedience, but that respect and trust could ensure loyalty over time. He cultivated a persona that balanced charm with menace, charisma with ruthlessness. Subordinates were inspired by his vision. Rivals were wary of his cunning. Luciano understood that control was as much about shaping minds as enforcing rules. Every meeting, every negotiation, every handshake was carefully calculated to consolidate power and maintain dominance. He was not simply a gangster. He was a strategist, a tactician, a man orchestrating a vast network with precision and subtlety. Yet even as Luciano consolidated power, he never allowed complacency. He was acutely aware that betrayal could arise from any quarter, and he monitored his network with constant vigilance. Trusted lieutenants were tested regularly, rival factions were observed and neutralized if necessary. This balance of inclusion and scrutiny created an environment where loyalty was earned, fear was real, and the empire remained cohesive even under immense pressure. Luciano's leadership was simultaneously inspiring and intimidating, a combination that discouraged dissent while encouraging cooperation. The empire's reach extended far beyond the streets of New York. Luciano recognized the strategic importance of national and even international connections. He forged alliances with figures in Chicago, Detroit, and beyond, creating a web that allowed coordinated operations across state lines. He also understood the importance of influence in legitimate sectors, unions, businesses, and politics, using them as tools to further protect and expand his operations. Luciano's vision was not merely to control territory, but to control the flow of opportunity and resources, turning the underworld into a system that mirrored legitimate commerce, with him at its center. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's rise was his ability to adapt and innovate. While other mobsters clung to tradition and relied on brute force, Luciano embraced new methods and technologies to enhance efficiency. He integrated communications, logistics, and intelligence gathering into criminal operations, ensuring that his empire could respond swiftly to threats and capitalize on opportunities. Innovation became a hallmark of his leadership, setting him apart from rivals who relied solely on muscle or fear. The psychological weight of empire building was immense. Luciano bore the constant burden of maintaining loyalty, managing rivalries, and anticipating betrayal. Each day brought potential threats, from law enforcement, competing gangs, and even within his own ranks. The mental strain was compounded by the need for discretion. Any sign of weakness could provoke challenges to his authority. Yet, for Luciano, the risk was part of the game, a necessary component of power. He thrived on the tension, the constant calculation, and the delicate balance between control and chaos. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Luciano's empire had reached a scale previously unimaginable. He had effectively unified New York's organized crime under his strategic vision, creating a model that combined discipline, efficiency, and psychological mastery. Rival gangs recognized his dominance, law enforcement acknowledged his reach, and even politicians and businessmen found themselves entwined in his influence. Yet, as immense as this power was, it was also fragile, dependent on a delicate network of loyalty, fear, and strategic genius. This duality, unmatched authority paired with ever-present vulnerability, would define the rest of Luciano's life, setting the stage for both his legendary influence and his eventual downfall. The building of his empire was not merely a tale of criminal success, it was a psychological and historical phenomenon. Luciano's genius lay in seeing beyond the immediate violence and territorial disputes of the streets to envision a systematic, enduring structure of organized crime, one that would outlast him and influence generations to come. It was a combination of intelligence, ambition, and audacity, tempered with pragmatism and foresight, that allowed him to rise above the chaos of his era. The empire he built was as much a testament to human psychology as it was to criminal ingenuity, a reflection of a mind capable of converting disorder into order, fear into obedience, and ambition into lasting power. In the world Luciano was building, raw power alone could not sustain an empire. The streets could be won with bullets and intimidation, but to maintain control over men, operations, and territories required something far more subtle: the unspoken code that governed loyalty, secrecy, and honor. This was the Code of Omerta, the unwritten law of the Mafia, a psychological framework that bound men together even in the face of fear, temptation, and betrayal. For Luciano, understanding and enforcing this code was as critical as his strategic genius, for it allowed him to orchestrate an empire that was disciplined, cohesive, and resilient in the face of chaos. Omerta demanded obedience, but it also demanded silence. Betrayal, informants, or public disclosure of secrets were unforgivable transgressions. To the untrained eye, this might appear as simple fear-based control, yet it was far more nuanced. Luciano recognized that fear alone could be brittle, fleeting. The truly effective power came from the internalization of rules, from men who believed in loyalty because it was a principle, not merely a requirement. He cultivated this belief through a combination of respect, strategic generosity, and calculated intimidation. The code was both a shield and a weapon, ensuring cohesion while punishing dissent without destabilizing the broader structure. Psychologically, Omerta served as a mirror for human behavior, exploiting both virtue and vice. It leveraged ambition, ego, and survival instinct, shaping men into predictable instruments of the organization. Luciano understood that loyalty could be engineered through carefully placed incentives, promotions for competence, protection for service, and subtle displays of power to reinforce hierarchy. Punishments were decisive and public when necessary, signaling the consequences of betrayal. By embedding fear, respect, and reward into the daily life of his associates, Luciano created an internalized system of control, a mental architecture that ensured compliance even without his direct supervision. The practical implications of Omerta were profound. It allowed Luciano's operations to function with astonishing efficiency, even under pressure. Information moved selectively, threats were neutralized discreetly, and rivalries could be managed without triggering uncontrolled chaos. Associates knew the boundaries. They could act boldly within the empire, but stepping outside the code carried the certainty of consequences. This predictability was crucial for orchestrating large-scale operations, from gambling rings and labor rackets to smuggling and prostitution. The code created an invisible infrastructure that underpinned the empire, transforming individual actions into coordinated outcomes. Omerta also served as a psychological mechanism for trust. In an environment defined by betrayal and survival, trust was a rare commodity. By adhering to the code, men demonstrated reliability, signaling that they could be counted upon under extreme circumstances. For Luciano, this trust was currency. It allowed him to delegate responsibilities, coordinate complex schemes, and maintain authority over vast networks without micromanaging every operation. Men who broke the code were not merely punished. They were made examples of, reinforcing the mental framework that made loyalty habitual, almost instinctive. Yet the code was not without tension. It created moral ambiguity, forcing men to choose between personal survival and collective obligation. Murders could be sanctioned if dictated by loyalty. Betrayals were unforgivable even if survival demanded them. Luciano navigated this tension with psychological precision. He reinforced the notion that adherence to Omerta was not only a practical necessity but a matter of personal honor, linking identity, morality, and power in a way that made the rules nearly unbreakable. The code became an internal compass for his men, shaping behavior as effectively as any law enforcement presence. Luciano's mastery of Omerta extended beyond his immediate circle. He understood that influence and intimidation were amplified by perception. Stories of ruthless enforcement, sudden disappearances, and unwavering loyalty spread through the criminal underworld like a warning and a guide. Even those outside his organization came to respect, fear, and conform to its principles when interacting with his empire. Omerta was simultaneously a psychological tool for insiders and a cultural weapon for outsiders, reinforcing the boundaries of the empire while expanding its reputation and influence. The emotional dimension of Omerta cannot be understated. For men operating under the code, loyalty carried weight, pride, and consequence. The system manipulated both fear and ambition, creating a psychological landscape where decisions were filtered through the lens of collective rules. For Luciano, this was a profound advantage. He could predict behavior, manipulate outcomes, and maintain cohesion even in the most volatile circumstances. The empire thrived not merely because of guns and money, but because its members were mentally conditioned to act in concert with an invisible set of principles, internalized to the point of instinct. Omerta also shaped Luciano's own psychology. He internalized the code as both shield and sword, guiding his actions while providing a framework to anticipate and respond to betrayal. His strategic mind constantly calculated risk within the boundaries of loyalty, and he instinctively understood the emotional and cognitive mechanisms that would drive compliance. This dual awareness, of himself and of others, allowed him to wield power with extraordinary subtlety, ensuring that the organization functioned smoothly even in his absence. By institutionalizing Omerta within his empire, Luciano transformed organized crime from chaotic street gangs into a disciplined, enduring enterprise. The code was more than tradition. It was a psychological infrastructure, a moral and operational compass that guided behavior, mitigated risk, and amplified power. It allowed him to maintain cohesion, orchestrate complex operations, and project influence across cities and states. Without it, the sprawling network of loyalty, profit, and violence that defined his empire would have collapsed under its own weight. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta exemplifies the genius of Luciano's leadership. It was a system that combined discipline, psychology, and morality into a functional framework of control, enabling him to manage an empire that stretched across New York and beyond. The code was both invisible and omnipresent, shaping behavior, consolidating power, and ensuring the longevity of his empire. It stands as a testament to his understanding of human nature, that loyalty, fear, and ambition can be woven into a system more enduring than brute force, and that true mastery of power requires as much psychological insight as it does physical dominance. Luciano's genius lay not just in power or fear, but in turning the violent chaos of the streets into a meticulously managed business. While many mobsters treated crime as a series of opportunistic attacks and territorial skirmishes, Luciano approached it with a corporate mindset, treating every operation as a venture with structure, oversight, and measurable profit. Gambling dens, bootlegging operations, prostitution rings, and labor rackets were no longer isolated pockets of income. They were interconnected revenue streams, carefully coordinated to maximize efficiency and minimize risk. For Luciano, crime was not merely survival, it was enterprise. The foundation of this business-minded approach was division of labor. Each component of the empire had a specialized function. Enforcers maintained discipline and protected assets. Accountants managed the flow of money, negotiators ensured alliances and compliance, and lieutenants oversaw operations on a local level. Luciano's ability to delegate was key to scaling the empire. He did not need to be present for every deal or every collection. The structure itself allowed him to maintain control while focusing on strategy and expansion. This approach mirrored legitimate businesses of the era, but with lethal stakes and the ever-present shadow of violence. One of the empire's most lucrative operations was gambling. From clandestine poker rooms to underground betting parlors, Luciano orchestrated an enterprise that stretched across New York and beyond. Gambling was not simply a pastime, it was a controlled, predictable source of revenue that could be monitored, taxed, and protected. Luciano introduced systems for oversight and accountability, ensuring that profits flowed efficiently and that cheating or defection was swiftly punished. In his mind, gambling was both a science and an art, a carefully calibrated balance of trust, oversight, and enforcement. Prohibition provided another major avenue for profit. Bootlegging operations transformed alcohol into one of the empire's most lucrative commodities, and Luciano's operations were highly organized. Smugglers, distributors, and local operators formed a coordinated chain, allowing liquor to flow from production to speakeasies with minimal risk of disruption. Luciano negotiated with rival gangs, bribed law enforcement, and manipulated political figures to secure smooth operations. The business of crime, under his control, became a sophisticated network that rivaled legitimate corporations in efficiency, but with an added layer of intimidation to ensure compliance. Labor rackets and union influence added another dimension. Luciano recognized that control over unions and labor organizations allowed him to extend influence into legitimate industries, from construction to shipping. By infiltrating these organizations, he could orchestrate strikes, manipulate contracts, and collect protection fees from businesses. This was a masterstroke of strategy. It allowed the criminal empire to generate income while embedding itself into the economic fabric of the city. It also blurred the lines between legality and illegality, creating a complex web that was difficult for authorities to penetrate. The psychological sophistication of Luciano's approach cannot be understated. He understood human motivations, greed, fear, loyalty, and leveraged them systematically. Men working for him were aware of the rewards for compliance and the consequences for betrayal, creating an internal system of incentives and deterrence. This psychological framework allowed him to scale operations while maintaining a high level of control, ensuring that the empire's complexity did not lead to chaos. By embedding fear and respect into the operational structure, he created a business that was both self-regulating and adaptive. Luciano's criminal enterprise also had an international dimension. He recognized the advantages of transnational connections, particularly with Havana and other ports, for smuggling and coordination. These networks allowed the flow of goods, money, and intelligence across borders, expanding the empire's influence far beyond the local streets. This global perspective was revolutionary for organized crime at the time. Luciano saw opportunity where others saw risk, and his ability to integrate international operations into his business model demonstrated a vision that extended beyond immediate profit to long-term strategic dominance. Yet the empire was not just about money, it was about control. Luciano's business operations created dependencies. People relied on his protection, his networks, and his negotiation skills. By controlling key revenue streams, he ensured that both allies and rivals were tied to his decisions. The empire's reach was psychological as much as financial. He was not merely a provider of services, but a manipulator of influence, leveraging every operation to reinforce loyalty and authority. This duality, profit and power intertwined, is what made Luciano's enterprise so enduring. The emotional and psychological stakes of running such a complex criminal business were immense. Luciano had to constantly anticipate threats, from law enforcement crackdowns to rival gangs plotting betrayal. Every operation required careful planning, constant oversight, and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The mental toll was significant, yet it also fueled his sense of mastery. In the high-stakes world of organized crime, where a single miscalculation could mean death or imprisonment, Luciano thrived. The complexity, risk, and rewards of the enterprise became both a challenge and a source of psychological satisfaction, cementing his reputation as a visionary leader. By the early 1930s, Luciano had transformed the concept of organized crime. He had taken a violent, fragmented underworld and imposed systems, strategy, and psychological discipline to create an empire that was profitable, resilient, and adaptive. Every operation was a carefully calibrated mechanism, every subordinate a cog in a larger machine, and every rival a potential obstacle to be managed or neutralized. The empire was not just a criminal network. It was a manifestation of Luciano's intellect, ambition, and ability to shape both people and systems to his will. In essence, the business of crime under Luciano was a study in organization, psychology, and strategy. It was not merely about taking what one could from the world, but about creating a structure that could sustain itself, expand, and endure beyond the man who built it. This approach would redefine the Mafia, establishing principles of order, discipline, and profit that future generations would emulate. Luciano's genius lay in seeing organized crime not as a chaotic battle of street gangs, but as a disciplined, scalable, and strategic enterprise, an empire built on fear, loyalty, and business acumen in equal measure. Even the most meticulously built empire depends on people, and in Luciano's world, alliances were as critical as muscle. Power was never exercised in isolation. It required the delicate balancing of trust, fear, and strategy. Luciano's genius was not just in creating systems, but in managing relationships, knowing which alliances to forge, which rivalries to tolerate, and which enemies to eliminate before they became a threat. Every handshake, every negotiation, every shared venture was a calculated move in a larger game of influence, a game in which the stakes were not just territory or money but survival itself. Allies were essential, but they were never guaranteed. Luciano understood that ambition was contagious. Those who rose under his protection could also rise to challenge him. To maintain control, he fostered loyalty through a combination of respect, rewards, and psychological insight. Promising rising lieutenants positions of influence, access to profitable ventures, and protection from law enforcement, he created a network in which obedience was incentivized. At the same time, he maintained a subtle, constant awareness of potential betrayal, ensuring that no subordinate ever became too independent or too powerful. Some of Luciano's closest allies were instrumental in transforming his vision into reality. Figures like Meyer Lansky, an astute strategist and financier, provided both brains and credibility, bridging the worlds of organized crime and legitimate enterprise. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of cross-ethnic alliances, finding common ground with Jewish, Irish, and Italian gangs who had once clashed violently. These partnerships were fragile by design. They required constant management, negotiation, and psychological calibration. Yet, in their careful orchestration, Luciano demonstrated a rare capacity for foresight, seeing patterns that others could not, predicting conflicts before they erupted, and turning potential rivals into collaborators. Enemies, of course, were equally influential in shaping the empire. The criminal underworld was inherently unstable, and threats could emerge from any quarter: a rival gang asserting dominance, a betrayed lieutenant plotting revenge, or even a law enforcement officer exploiting weakness. Luciano understood the psychology of his enemies as well as that of his allies. He observed tendencies, anticipated reactions, and neutralized threats preemptively, often without a shot being fired. Assassinations, intimidation, and strategic maneuvering were all tools in his arsenal, deployed with the precision of a chess master moving pieces across a board. The interplay between allies and enemies created a constant tension that defined Luciano's leadership. He operated in a world where trust was provisional, and loyalty was tested continuously. Even the most trusted partners could be lured by opportunity, coerced by threats, or swayed by ambition. This reality demanded constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and the ability to manipulate perceptions. Luciano's psychological acuity allowed him to maintain the balance. He rewarded loyalty visibly, punished betrayal decisively, and cultivated an environment where obedience was both desirable and rational. At the same time, Luciano recognized the power of reputation. Fear and respect were not abstract concepts, they were tangible assets. By projecting both ruthlessness and fairness, he ensured that potential rivals thought twice before challenging him. Stories of swift retribution for betrayal circulated through the underworld, reinforcing his authority without requiring constant personal intervention. This reputation was carefully managed, a psychological extension of his empire, ensuring that both allies and enemies internalized the consequences of their choices. Alliances also involved complex negotiations with external forces, including politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen. Luciano understood that power extended beyond the streets. Influence over these figures could provide protection, legitimacy, and opportunities to expand operations. These relationships required subtlety and psychological insight. Bribes, favors, and promises of support were tools to align interests, while deception, manipulation, and calculated threats ensured compliance. Through these external alliances, Luciano's empire gained stability and reach that few rivals could match. Yet the tension between allies and enemies was never static. Power dynamics shifted constantly, and even the most loyal associates could be swayed by personal ambition. Luciano's genius was in managing these shifts, anticipating fractures, and orchestrating responses before conflicts became crises. Betrayal was inevitable in such a volatile environment, but he transformed these moments into opportunities. A disloyal lieutenant could be replaced, a rival neutralized, and the empire's cohesion maintained. His strategic mind treated human behavior as both predictable and manipulable, allowing him to navigate a world defined by uncertainty with remarkable control. Emotionally, this balance exacted a toll. Luciano had to suppress trust, fear, and attachment simultaneously. Friendships were always provisional. Affection could be weaponized, loyalty could be rewarded or revoked based on utility. He developed an almost clinical understanding of human motivation, recognizing that the men around him were driven by a combination of fear, greed, ambition, and respect. By channeling these motivations effectively, he ensured that the empire functioned smoothly, even in the face of betrayal and internal tension. Ultimately, the interplay of allies and enemies was not just a matter of survival, it was a defining feature of Luciano's leadership. It illustrated the duality that would characterize his life: charisma and ruthlessness, strategy and intimidation, trust and suspicion. His empire was as much a psychological construct as it was a financial or territorial one, sustained by relationships carefully nurtured, manipulated, and monitored. Every alliance reinforced authority, every rivalry tested resolve, and every act of betrayal or loyalty contributed to the delicate equilibrium of power. By mastering the dynamics of human behavior, Luciano created an environment in which his influence could be projected across the criminal world. Allies became instruments of strategy, enemies became opportunities for consolidation, and the intricate balance between the two allowed him to maintain a level of control unmatched in his era. This careful orchestration of relationships, blending psychological insight with strategic calculation, is what transformed Luciano from a rising gangster into the architect of a criminal empire, capable of commanding loyalty, managing fear, and neutralizing threats on a scale few could imagine. The story of his allies and enemies, therefore, is more than just a catalogue of betrayals and partnerships. It is a study in human psychology, power dynamics, and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. It is a testament to Luciano's capacity to perceive patterns in chaos, to manipulate intentions, and to maintain authority in a world where loyalty was fleeting and threats were constant. This delicate dance between cooperation and conflict would continue to define his empire, shaping both his rise and the challenges he would eventually face in the turbulent years ahead. Beneath the surface of Luciano's carefully constructed empire, a hidden war raged, one not fought solely with bullets, but with strategy, manipulation, and psychological dominance. While the world saw the glamour of nightclubs, speakeasies, and high-stakes gambling, the underworld pulsed with conflict, betrayal, and intrigue. Rival gangs, government authorities, and even his own lieutenants tested the boundaries of his authority. Every day was a battle for control, survival, and supremacy, waged not only in the streets but in whispered conversations, backroom deals, and the shadows of power. This hidden war was a product of the volatile era in which Luciano operated. Prohibition had fueled unprecedented wealth for organized crime, but it also amplified competition. Every successful operation attracted attention, from rival gangs hungry for territory, from law enforcement eager to make examples, and from ambitious underlings within Luciano's own ranks. The struggle for dominance was continuous and multi-layered, requiring constant vigilance, anticipation of threats, and strategic countermeasures. In many ways, the empire's outward appearance of stability masked the high-stakes tension simmering beneath. Rival gangs posed one of the most persistent threats. While Luciano had unified many factions, others remained fiercely independent or opposed his expansion. These adversaries tested his alliances, attempted to undermine operations, and sometimes resorted to violent retaliation. Each encounter was a psychological contest as much as a physical one. Luciano's response was deliberate. Intimidation, strategic negotiation, and selective use of violence created a delicate equilibrium. Rivals were rarely destroyed recklessly. Rather, they were neutralized in ways that reinforced his authority while minimizing disruption to the larger network. The government also played a central role in this hidden war. Law enforcement agencies, motivated by both justice and political pressure, scrutinized Luciano's empire relentlessly. Federal investigators, city detectives, and prosecutors pursued evidence, surveillance, and informants, attempting to dismantle his operations piece by piece. Luciano understood the power of information and the vulnerabilities of perception. He cultivated relationships with politicians and police officers, deployed bribes judiciously, and created layers of separation between himself and illegal activities. The hidden war against the law was fought as much in strategy rooms and offices as in the streets, requiring careful calculation, patience, and psychological insight. Internal threats added another layer of tension. Even loyal associates could become unpredictable under pressure, ambition, or fear. A single act of betrayal could trigger chaos, and Luciano's success depended on his ability to anticipate such moves. He employed surveillance, loyalty tests, and controlled responsibilities to mitigate risk, ensuring that no subordinate became too independent or too dangerous. This constant monitoring created a psychological landscape of tension. Men understood that obedience was rewarded, betrayal was punished, and even minor lapses could carry consequences. The hidden war was therefore as much about internal discipline as it was about external conquest. The stakes of this invisible conflict were deeply psychological. Luciano's mind was a battlefield where trust, fear, and strategy intersected. He had to remain constantly aware of the intentions, ambitions, and vulnerabilities of every person in his orbit. Miscalculations could lead to violent revolt, exposure to law enforcement, or the collapse of profitable ventures. The emotional strain was immense, yet it also sharpened his instincts. Luciano thrived on the tension, using it to maintain control and manipulate outcomes, ensuring that the empire remained resilient even amidst uncertainty. In addition to personal and organizational threats, Luciano faced the challenge of maintaining cohesion across a sprawling network. His empire extended across neighborhoods, cities, and even international borders, involving men with diverse backgrounds, interests, and temperaments. Coordinating these operations required not just logistics but psychological insight. He needed to balance competing ambitions, manage rivalries, and enforce loyalty without alienating key figures. The hidden war was thus as much about orchestration and diplomacy as it was about conflict and violence. This period also demonstrated Luciano's extraordinary strategic foresight. He recognized that the empire could not survive if it relied solely on brute force or intimidation. Instead, he developed systems to preempt crises, establishing channels for negotiation, creating hierarchies to manage disputes, and instituting rules of conduct to prevent destructive infighting. By institutionalizing these mechanisms, he transformed constant tension into a controlled, manageable force, turning the hidden war into a structured environment that reinforced his authority. Emotionally, the hidden war exacted a heavy toll. Luciano lived under the constant weight of surveillance, betrayal, and strategic calculation. Every decision carried risk, every alliance was contingent, and every interaction had consequences. The psychological pressure of maintaining control, anticipating threats, and orchestrating complex operations required extraordinary resilience. Yet this crucible also honed his genius, reinforcing his reputation as a man who could navigate chaos, manipulate human behavior, and maintain dominance where others would falter. The hidden war also extended to public perception. Luciano understood that myth and legend were powerful tools in managing both allies and enemies. Stories of his ruthlessness, intelligence, and strategic brilliance spread through the underworld, enhancing his influence while deterring potential challengers. Reputation became both shield and weapon, allowing him to project authority even when not physically present. The psychological warfare inherent in perception was as critical as any gunfight or negotiation. Ultimately, the hidden war was a defining element of Luciano's leadership. It exemplified the duality of his empire, outwardly stable, profitable, and disciplined, inwardly tense, contested, and meticulously managed. It showcased his ability to operate simultaneously on multiple planes, orchestrating operations, managing alliances, neutralizing threats, and controlling perception. This ongoing struggle between chaos and order, loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect, was both the engine of his empire and the crucible that would test his genius. By mastering this hidden war, Luciano secured his dominance while preparing the empire for challenges yet to come. He demonstrated that power was not merely the ability to wield violence, but the capacity to navigate a complex network of human ambition, fear, and desire. The hidden war was the invisible battlefield upon which his legacy was forged, a testament to strategic brilliance, psychological insight, and the relentless pressures of life at the top of a criminal empire. Even the most carefully constructed empire carries within it the seeds of vulnerability. For lucky Luciano, the rise to unmatched power was mirrored by the subtle, inexorable forces that would eventually begin his downfall. By the late 1930s, law enforcement scrutiny was intensifying, rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and the very men who owed their positions to him sometimes entertained thoughts of ambition beyond obedience. Luciano's genius had allowed him to control chaos for years, but no empire, however meticulously organized, is immune to the consequences of its own success. The fall began not with a single dramatic event, but as a series of fractures in the network he had so carefully built. Law enforcement had grown more sophisticated, adopting surveillance techniques, informants, and federal prosecution strategies that challenged the traditional protections of the Mafia. For years, Luciano had skillfully insulated himself from direct exposure, delegating risky operations to lieutenants and maintaining layers of plausible deniability. Yet the tightening scrutiny meant that his carefully maintained invisibility was increasingly at risk. Each investigation, each subpoena, and each questioning chipped away at the aura of invulnerability he had cultivated. Rivalries and betrayals also emerged as threats. Ambitious associates, once loyal under fear and respect, began to test boundaries. Power, even when carefully distributed, can breed envy and resentment. Some allies, seeing opportunities to advance their own position, began to act independently, skirting the lines of loyalty. Others quietly negotiated with law enforcement, leveraging information for leniency or personal gain. Luciano's mastery of psychology and control could not fully prevent these cracks. The very structure that had made his empire efficient also created dependencies that could be exploited by the discontented or the daring. The arrest that signaled the beginning of Luciano's personal downfall was itself a reflection of decades of accumulated tension. Charged with serious violations including running prostitution rings, he faced not just the legal weight of the state but the compounded pressure of a life built on secrecy and manipulation. For the first time, the protective layers of his empire could not shield him. Associates who once obeyed him without question now faced moral, legal, or strategic choices: defend him, betray him, or distance themselves entirely. This moment of vulnerability marked a psychological turning point. The man who had orchestrated power with near-absolute control now confronted the fragility of that influence firsthand. The nature of betrayal in Luciano's world was both personal and strategic. Former allies could become witnesses, confidences once shared could be weaponized, the very networks that had been his greatest strength could now expose him. He understood the stakes instantly. A single misstep could unravel years of careful planning. The realization was both practical and psychological. No longer operating as the omnipotent strategist, Luciano was forced into a reactive stance, navigating the same fear and uncertainty he had once imposed on others. It was a reversal that would profoundly shape the trajectory of his final years. Emotionally, the fall was compounded by isolation. As investigations and arrests tightened around him, Luciano faced the reality that his empire was larger than any one man, yet paradoxically dependent on him. He was both central to the operation and increasingly removed from its daily functioning. The distance created gaps in loyalty and oversight, while the constant threat of betrayal heightened psychological pressure. The man who had once walked confidently through backrooms and nightclubs, orchestrating influence with a nod or a whispered word, now had to navigate legal labyrinths and interpersonal uncertainties he could not fully control. Public perception also played a role in this descent. The media, hungry for sensational stories, portrayed Luciano not only as a criminal mastermind but as a symbol of organized crime's reach into American life. Headlines, court reporting, and gossip amplified his vulnerability, undermining the carefully constructed aura of untouchability. Rivals leveraged this exposure, exploiting perception to challenge his authority or negotiate favorable positions. In the world of organized crime, reputation is both armor and weapon, and for the first time, Luciano found it a double-edged sword. The psychological dimension of the fall is critical to understand. Power had always been a function of fear, loyalty, and control, yet now these very instruments were strained to the breaking point. Allies hesitated, rivals tested limits, law enforcement closed in. Luciano's mind, once a realm of strategic omnipotence, was now a battlefield of contingency, calculation, and adaptation. He had to anticipate threats he could not fully control, navigate loyalties he could not fully command, and maintain authority in the face of mounting uncertainty. The intensity of this pressure marked the beginning of a profound transformation in both his life and his psyche. Yet even as the fall began, Luciano's brilliance remained evident. He adapted quickly, employing negotiation, diversion, and strategic compliance to mitigate the immediate risks. By leveraging his knowledge of human behavior, he sought to manipulate outcomes even while under threat. The fall was not sudden destruction but a gradual erosion of control, a test of endurance as much as intellect. It revealed the limits of empire and the inevitability of consequence, even for men of extraordinary capability. In many ways, the beginning of Luciano's downfall reflects a universal truth about power. Absolute control is an illusion. The very systems that enable success, networks of loyalty, operational hierarchies, and psychological manipulation, also contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The rise of a king inevitably carries within it the seeds of decline, and in Luciano's case, the fall began as these seeds took root in the subtle fractures of his empire, the ambitions of his associates, and the relentless pressure of law and society. Thus, the story of his fall begins not with spectacle but with subtlety. A legal case here, a betrayal there, the quiet erosion of control beneath the surface of a seemingly invincible empire. It is a psychological narrative as much as a historical one, tracing the shift from dominance to vulnerability, from omnipotence to precarious survival. The fall begins here in the tension between power and consequence, loyalty and betrayal, control and chaos, a turning point that will define the final chapters of Luciano's extraordinary life. The courtroom was a stage where the carefully hidden world of organized crime collided with the glare of public scrutiny. For lucky Luciano, the trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a dramatic confrontation between empire and law, reputation and consequence, genius and vulnerability. Years of meticulous orchestration, psychological manipulation, and clandestine operations now faced the relentless machinery of justice. The stakes were immense. The outcome would determine not only his personal freedom but the future of the empire he had spent decades constructing. From the moment proceedings began, it was clear that the trial would be more than a legal contest. It was a battle for narrative control. Prosecutors sought to portray Luciano as the embodiment of moral corruption, a symbol of the Mafia's intrusion into American life. Newspapers sensationalized every detail, from lurid accusations of prostitution and gambling rackets to the complex networks of influence that stretched across cities. For the public, he was a larger-than-life figure, part myth, part monster, whose charisma and cunning had eluded law enforcement for years. For Luciano, the courtroom became a psychological arena where perception and strategy were as critical as facts and evidence. Luciano's defense had to navigate a delicate landscape. On one hand, he needed to challenge the prosecution's narrative. On the other, he had to maintain composure under intense scrutiny. Every gesture, every word, every expression was scrutinized not only by the jury but by the media and the underworld. The psychological pressure was extraordinary. The man who had once controlled rooms with a glance now had to respond to hostile questions, legal technicalities, and the weight of public judgment. The trial tested his resilience, patience, and strategic thinking in ways that no street fight or backroom negotiation ever had. The courtroom drama was amplified by the complex network of witnesses, informants, and associates. Some testified reluctantly, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, while others were strategically manipulated by law enforcement to expose critical details. Luciano had to anticipate every turn, every angle of attack, and respond without revealing weakness. The trial was a test not only of law but of human psychology, the ability to read people, anticipate behavior, and manipulate perception under immense pressure. For the first time, the criminal mastermind faced an opponent whose tools were transparency, evidence, and relentless scrutiny, forces that his normal arsenal of fear, loyalty, and intimidation could not fully counteract. The evidence presented was overwhelming in its detail, yet not always direct in connecting Luciano personally to criminal acts. His empire had always functioned on layers of delegation and plausible deniability, a system designed precisely to withstand such scrutiny. However, the sheer scale of the prosecution's case, combined with witness testimony and public outrage, created a climate in which acquittal became unlikely. Even as Luciano maintained outward composure, the psychological weight of exposure, the vulnerability of human error, and the relentless pressure of judgment began to weigh heavily. One of the most psychologically charged aspects of the trial was the tension between public image and personal reality. Luciano's reputation as the ultimate strategist, the man who could control people and operations with a glance, now faced the stark reality of vulnerability. The courtroom stripped away the layers of control he had long relied upon. The same networks that had protected him for decades could not shield him entirely from legal and moral accountability. He was forced into a reactive posture, responding to the narrative rather than controlling it, navigating uncertainty in a way that he had long forced others to navigate before him. Sentencing brought the emotional and psychological dimensions of the fall into sharp focus. Luciano was convicted and handed a lengthy prison term, a verdict that marked the first tangible consequences of the empire he had built. The decision reverberated through the underworld, signaling that even the most brilliant and ruthless figures were not invulnerable. For his associates, it was a moment of recalibration. Loyalty, strategy, and alliances had to be reconsidered in light of his temporary removal from active control. The sentence also forced Luciano to confront the fragility of human systems, no matter how meticulously designed. Even an empire constructed with foresight, discipline, and psychological insight could be shaken by forces beyond one's control. Emotionally, the trial and sentence were a crucible. Luciano had lived his life anticipating threats and manipulating outcomes, yet here was a scenario where his genius could not fully mitigate risk. The tension of uncertainty, the weight of judgment, and the exposure of his vulnerabilities created an acute psychological pressure that few could endure. Yet, true to his character, Luciano approached the situation with calculation, resilience, and strategic foresight, understanding that even imprisonment could become an arena for influence if approached correctly. The trial also highlighted the interplay between morality, legality, and perception. To the public, Luciano was a criminal. To the underworld, he was a leader, strategist, and symbol of power. In the courtroom, these dual realities collided. The narrative of law and justice clashed with the lived reality of an empire built on secrecy, loyalty, and calculated risk. For Luciano, managing this collision required not brute force but intelligence, the same skill set that had allowed him to build and sustain his empire in the first place. In retrospect, the trial and sentence represented more than legal consequences. They were a psychological turning point. They marked the beginning of a new phase in Luciano's life, one in which power had to be exercised from constrained circumstances. Influence had to be maintained through subtlety rather than presence, and strategy became survival as much as expansion. The courtroom became a symbolic battlefield, demonstrating that even the most brilliant minds are vulnerable to systemic forces, human error, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The story of Luciano's trial is therefore not just a historical event, but a study in psychology, strategy, and human resilience. It shows the collision of empire with law, reputation with accountability, and genius with vulnerability. For a man who had once orchestrated vast operations with a glance, the trial was a profound test of character, intellect, and adaptability, a prelude to the next chapter in his life, where influence would have to be maintained under the shadow of confinement, and legacy would depend on cunning as much as control. Even behind the cold, iron bars of prison, lucky Luciano's influence remained formidable. For a man whose life had been defined by control, strategy, and psychological mastery, confinement presented a challenge, not just of liberty but of authority. Yet true to his nature, Luciano adapted, transforming imprisonment into a new arena for power. He was no longer navigating the streets or negotiating in back rooms. He was navigating the subtle hierarchies of a penitentiary, where information, loyalty, and perception dictated influence as much as brute force or reputation outside. Luciano quickly recognized that a prison was, in many ways, a microcosm of the world he had once controlled on a much larger scale. Rivalries flared over resources, alliances were constantly tested, and reputations were fragile yet pivotal. Within this confined ecosystem, he applied the same principles that had made him a mastermind outside, understanding human psychology, anticipating behavior, and creating structures of loyalty. The men around him, both fellow inmates and guards, became pieces on a chessboard, and Luciano played the game with remarkable precision. He cultivated loyalty carefully. Influential inmates were courted with favors, protection, and access to resources. Others were subtly intimidated or strategically sidelined to ensure they posed no threat to his authority. Just as in his empire, the rules of reward and punishment maintained order. Those who aligned with him gained advantages. Those who resisted learned quickly that opposition carried consequences. Within months, Luciano had established a position of de facto leadership. a reflection of his enduring ability to exert control in environments where many would have been powerless. Information was perhaps the most valuable currency behind bars, and Luciano wielded it expertly. He built networks that allowed him to monitor rival factions, anticipate conflicts, and maintain channels to his associates outside prison walls. Messengers, coded correspondence, and discreet alliances ensured that he remained connected to the larger criminal enterprise. Through these channels, Luciano influenced operations, mediated disputes, and even orchestrated expansion of ventures beyond the prison gates. The man who had once controlled New York's underworld from back rooms now did so from a cell, proving that physical confinement did not necessarily limit strategic reach. Luciano's ability to exercise influence in prison relied on his keen understanding of human behavior. He read men with the same precision he had once applied to gangsters, politicians, and law enforcement officials. Fear, respect, ambition, and need were all tools to be leveraged. Guards could be influenced through subtle gestures, compliance, or negotiated advantage. Inmates could be guided through loyalty, intimidation, or psychological insight. Every interaction, every decision became a calculated move in a larger strategy. Even isolation could be transformed into opportunity, as it offered the time to reflect, plan, and observe the subtleties of human behavior within the prison ecosystem. The psychological weight of this power was immense. While he had previously managed empires in the open world, the stakes inside prison were highly personal. A single miscalculation could result in injury, betrayal, or loss of influence. Yet, for Luciano, the challenge was invigorating. The confinement forced him to refine his understanding of strategy and control, sharpening his instincts in an environment stripped of traditional tools of authority. In many ways, the prison experience was an extension of the hidden war he had navigated on the streets, a test of intellect, patience, and psychological acuity. Luciano's influence extended beyond immediate survival. It became strategic. He recognized that maintaining order and cohesion within prison had implications for the larger empire. By positioning himself as a mediator, leader, and strategist, he ensured that the organization outside remained stable. He could control disputes, advise loyal associates, and even guide operations without leaving his cell. In this sense, the prison walls became a new stage for his empire, a confined arena in which intellect and psychological skill substituted for mobility and direct action. Perhaps most remarkable was Luciano's ability to cultivate alliances with those who might have seemed outside his sphere of influence. Politicians, law enforcement officials, and influential public figures became indirect allies through negotiation, leverage, and persuasion. The lines between prison and freedom blurred as he extended his reach beyond the cell, demonstrating that power is not merely a function of location but of perception, strategy, and control over information. Even in confinement, Luciano's name carried weight, his counsel was sought, and his influence remained a vital force in the criminal underworld. The prison years also demanded introspection and adaptation. Luciano had to navigate a world in which every decision carried immediate personal consequence while simultaneously considering the long-term stability of his empire. It was a dual challenge: survive and maintain authority now, and secure the legacy of influence for the future. This dual focus sharpened his strategic mind, reinforcing his reputation as not just a criminal but a master of psychological and organizational power. Ultimately, Luciano's time behind bars demonstrated a profound truth about power. It is not merely about territory, money, or fear. True influence lies in the ability to navigate human behavior, manage perception, and maintain authority even under constraint. Luciano exemplified this principle, transforming imprisonment from a limitation into a platform for continued control. His leadership in confinement reinforced his image as a strategist whose intellect and psychological insight were as formidable as any weapon he had ever wielded outside. The legacy of this period is clear. Luciano's ability to exercise power behind bars ensured the continuity of his empire, preserved his influence, and demonstrated the durability of his strategic vision. It also revealed the depth of his psychological mastery. Even stripped of freedom, surrounded by potential threats, and facing constant surveillance, he could command respect, manipulate outcomes, and maintain control. The prison, intended as punishment, became an unexpected theater for his genius, proving that the mind can be as potent a tool of dominance as money, muscle, or violence. Luciano's release from prison did not mark a triumphant return to freedom, but the beginning of an uneasy, controlled exile. In 1946 he was deported to Italy, a country that had changed since his youth and where his power was diminished but not extinguished. For the first time in decades, Luciano confronted a world where he could no longer command influence with the same immediacy, where authority had to be negotiated rather than enforced. Exile was both a punishment and a crucible, testing his resilience, adaptability, and psychological insight on a new stage. Arriving in Naples, Luciano found a city scarred by war, politically unstable and culturally transformed. Unlike the familiar streets of New York where he had built his empire, here he was an outsider, a man whose reputation preceded him but whose capacity to act was limited by geography and circumstance. The Italian authorities monitored him, the underworld was fragmented, and old networks had decayed. Luciano faced the stark realization that exile was not merely physical displacement, it was a profound psychological challenge. He had to navigate identity, authority, and purpose in an environment where his previous tools of influence, fear, loyalty, and strategic organization, were only partially effective. Despite these constraints, Luciano demonstrated his enduring adaptability. He cultivated new alliances with local criminal figures, leveraging reputation and expertise to maintain relevance. While he could no longer command the vast empire of his prime, he became a consultant, advisor, and strategist, a mentor whose guidance shaped the emerging post-war criminal landscape in Italy and abroad. His influence extended subtly into the Americas, maintaining connections with New York lieutenants who still respected his authority and deferred to his counsel. Exile did not mean invisibility. Luciano's genius allowed him to operate within new limitations, reshaping his role rather than surrendering to it. The exile years were also a period of reflection and recalibration. Removed from the immediate pressures of empire building, Luciano confronted the personal consequences of decades of power, betrayal, and violence. He witnessed the fragility of human systems, the impermanence of dominance, and the inevitability of time's erosion on both influence and life. Yet he also understood that power was not merely a function of presence. It could endure through networks, perception, and strategic insight. He began to frame his legacy not only through the empire he had built but through the ideas, structures, and psychological principles that would shape organized crime for generations. Luciano's physical health and emotional state were challenged by exile. The luxuries of control, the adrenaline of immediate authority, and the constant engagement with human ambition and fear were replaced with isolation, uncertainty, and reflection. He had to adapt psychologically, finding new avenues for influence and engagement while confronting the limits imposed by circumstance. This period forced him to balance nostalgia for past dominance with the pragmatism required for survival and relevance. The exile years became a meditation on the duality of power, its impermanence and its endurance through strategy, reputation, and insight. Yet Luciano remained active, even if indirectly. His advice influenced American operations, his connections facilitated transnational networks, and his counsel shaped emerging leaders. In this way, exile became a platform for intellectual and strategic influence rather than immediate command. Luciano's genius was evident in the subtlety of his power, guiding decisions, mediating disputes, and shaping the evolution of organized crime from afar. It was a testament to his understanding that true authority is psychological as much as physical, the ability to shape behavior, anticipate outcomes, and maintain loyalty across distance and circumstance. Exile also provided Luciano with a unique vantage point to observe the consequences of his own life. He saw the fragility of empires, the toll of violence, and the human cost of ambition. He witnessed former allies fall, enemies rise, and the world continue to move beyond his direct control. This period of observation reinforced his appreciation for the principles that had guided his rise: discipline, loyalty, strategic calculation, and psychological insight. Even in exile, these lessons remained relevant, shaping his engagement with the world and the legacy he sought to leave behind. The emotional dimension of exile cannot be overstated. For a man whose identity had been defined by power, freedom, and strategic mastery, the restriction of movement and authority was a profound challenge. Yet Luciano's response was emblematic of his lifelong resilience. He reframed the limitations as opportunities for influence in different ways, turning psychological acumen into his primary tool of engagement. By shifting focus from immediate control to enduring strategy, he demonstrated an adaptability that few could match, transforming a punitive exile into a stage for continued intellectual and organizational impact. Philosophically, the exile years marked a subtle transformation. Luciano's perspective shifted from immediate domination to enduring influence. He began to consider the structures he had built not only as mechanisms of profit and control but as instruments for shaping human behavior, organizational cohesion, and the evolution of criminal enterprise. In this sense, exile was not a retreat but a continuation of his life's work in a more reflective, strategic, and psychologically nuanced form. It became a period of intellectual consolidation, in which his understanding of power deepened even as his physical reach diminished. Ultimately, exile framed the endgame of Luciano's life not as a fall from grace but as a recalibration of influence. While he could no longer move freely through the streets of New York or enforce loyalty with immediate presence, his strategies, psychological insight, and reputation ensured that his impact remained significant. He learned, perhaps more deeply than ever, that power is both ephemeral and enduring, that while empires can crumble, influence can persist through intellect, networks, and the careful shaping of human behavior. The exile years are therefore both a coda and a continuation, a period in which Luciano confronted the limits of physical power, navigated new challenges of authority, and refined the principles that had made him legendary. They are a testament to his adaptability, his psychological acumen, and his enduring ability to shape the world even when removed from its immediate control. In exile, Luciano's story becomes a meditation on the duality of power, the tension between presence and perception, freedom and limitation, control and influence, a fitting reflection of a life spent at the intersection of human ambition, strategy, and consequence. Lucky Luciano's life did not end with his exile, imprisonment, or even the dismantling of some of his immediate operations. It ended with a legacy that reshaped the very nature of organized crime. To understand his influence is to recognize a man who transcended the streets, the backrooms, and the immediate violence of the Mafia, and who instead imposed a vision, a system, and a psychological architecture that would define the underworld for generations. Luciano was not merely a gangster, he was a strategist, a psychologist, and, in many ways, an architect of human behavior within the criminal world. His greatest innovation was the transformation of organized crime from a series of chaotic, competing street gangs into a disciplined, hierarchical, and strategic enterprise. Prior to Luciano, power in the underworld was often localized, fragmented, and volatile. Violence was the primary language and loyalty was enforced only by fear. Luciano changed all that. He introduced systems, rules, and structures that transformed these fragmented elements into a cohesive network capable of both collaboration and expansion. He professionalized crime, making it scalable, organized, and resilient. This was not merely about profit, it was about control, the creation of an ecosystem where human behavior, incentives, and fear worked in harmony to sustain an empire. The psychology of loyalty and fear that Luciano mastered is perhaps the most enduring element of his legacy. He understood that control was never absolute, that men are motivated by ambition, greed, and self-interest, and that loyalty must be cultivated as a habit, not demanded as obedience. Through omerta and strategic rewards, he internalized discipline among his associates, creating a network in which loyalty was both rational and instinctive. The genius of this approach is visible not only in the survival of his own empire for decades but also in the way organized crime structures around the world continue to reflect these principles. Luciano demonstrated that human behavior, if properly understood and guided, could be as powerful a tool as weapons or money. Luciano's influence extended far beyond New York. The model he created, often called the National Crime Syndicate, established alliances across ethnic and territorial lines, incorporating Jewish, Italian, and other criminal networks into a coordinated system. This was revolutionary. For the first time, organized crime was not purely local or parochial. It became national, even international. His influence touched Cuba, Italy, and various points across the United States, demonstrating that strategy, coordination, and negotiation could extend power far beyond immediate territory. He created not only wealth and control but a blueprint for criminal enterprise that outlived him. The contrast between myth and man is also central to his legacy. To the public and to popular culture, Luciano became a symbol of cunning, danger, glamour, and ruthlessness. Yet the man himself was complex, disciplined, calculating, strategic, and psychologically insightful. He combined charisma with cruelty, intellect with pragmatism. This duality made him fascinating, terrifying, and ultimately enduring in the public imagination. The myth amplified his influence, the man ensured its substance. Understanding Luciano requires embracing both. The legend shaped the culture of crime, the man shaped its structure. Luciano's methods also influenced legitimate organizational theory and leadership, albeit indirectly. His approach, division of labor, hierarchy, delegation, strategic alliances, and psychological management, mirrored principles used in corporate and political organizations. While morally and legally opposed, the mechanics of his control and influence illustrate timeless principles of leadership. Predict behavior, create incentive structures, manage perception, and maintain cohesion even under pressure. In this way, Luciano's legacy transcends crime, offering insights into power, organization, and human motivation that resonate beyond the underworld. Another enduring element of his legacy is the psychological blueprint of control he left behind. He demonstrated that fear alone is insufficient for sustaining influence. Loyalty must be embedded, trust must be earned, and perception must be managed. The methods he pioneered, calculated enforcement, selective reward, reputation management, remain central to organized crime operations worldwide. His insight into human behavior allowed him to create a system where obedience was rational, betrayal was predictable, and power was maintained without the constant presence of the leader. This approach ensured that his influence persisted long after his removal from direct control. Luciano also left a mark on the way society and law enforcement perceive organized crime. His life highlighted the sophistication, adaptability, and intelligence required to manage such networks. He forced authorities to develop new investigative methods, surveillance strategies, and legal approaches. In a sense, his legacy extends into the evolution of policing and legal strategy, illustrating the interplay between criminal innovation and societal response. The systems he developed required equally sophisticated responses, underscoring the intellectual dimensions of both crime and its prevention. Emotionally and culturally, Luciano's legacy is layered. He is remembered as both a villain and a visionary, a man of ruthless ambition and extraordinary intellect. His life story embodies the tensions between loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability, freedom and consequence. The narrative of his rise, empire building, imprisonment, exile, and influence captures the human fascination with control, strategy, and the consequences of ambition. These are not simply historical facts. They are enduring psychological and cultural lessons about power and human behavior. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is not limited to the dollars he controlled, the territories he commanded, or the operations he orchestrated. It lies in the systems, strategies, and psychological frameworks he created, principles that allowed organized crime to endure, evolve, and expand long after his death. His influence can be traced in the very structure of modern criminal enterprises, in the alliances, hierarchies, and codes that govern them. He proved that power is as much a product of intellect and insight as it is of force, and that legacy is preserved not merely through domination but through the systems one leaves behind. Luciano's story, in the end, is a meditation on human ambition, strategy, and consequence. It is a study of the interplay between intellect and morality, loyalty and betrayal, and control and chaos. His life teaches that power is never static, that influence can endure even when presence is limited, and that the greatest leaders, even in crime, are those who understand the minds of men as well as the mechanics of action. In this sense, Lucky Luciano's legacy is eternal, not merely as a criminal, but as a master of human behavior, organization, and strategic thought. As Lucky Luciano's story comes to a close, it becomes clear that his life was less about a single man and more about the forces he embodied: ambition, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of influence. His journey through the underworld reflects the contrast that defined him: rise and fall, loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect, freedom and confinement. Luciano's life illustrates that even the most brilliant architects of power are vulnerable to the fragility of human systems, law, and circumstance. Luciano transformed chaos into order. From his early days on the streets of New York to building a national crime syndicate, he demonstrated that true power is not only wealth or territory, but the ability to anticipate human behavior, manipulate perception, and maintain influence across networks of loyalty and ambition. He professionalized organized crime, creating hierarchies, systems, and psychological frameworks that ensured cohesion, efficiency, and resilience. His genius lay as much in understanding people as in orchestrating operations. Yet Luciano's story also demonstrates the limits of human control. Even a man of extraordinary intellect is subject to consequence. Imprisonment, exile, and legal scrutiny revealed the inevitability of vulnerability. What set Luciano apart was his adaptability, his ability to survive, influence, and shape outcomes even when stripped of immediate authority. He turned constraint into opportunity, using intellect and psychological insight to maintain relevance long after his removal from direct power. Culturally, Luciano's legacy endures as both myth and reality. Popular imagination remembers him as ruthless, cunning, and charismatic, But beneath the legend was a disciplined strategist and master of human behavior. His duality, feared yet respected, ruthless yet strategic, captures the imagination because it reflects the complexities of power itself. He showed that influence can persist not through fear alone, but through loyalty, perception, and carefully designed systems. Luciano's innovations created a blueprint for modern organized crime, demonstrating that legacy depends on principles and structures that outlive the individual. Even in exile, he continued to shape networks, advise associates, and guide operations indirectly. His life teaches that power is transient, but influence endures. Leadership requires intellect, psychological insight, and adaptability. True authority is as much about guiding human behavior as it is about commanding obedience. Ultimately, Luciano's story is a meditation on strategy, ambition, and consequence. It reminds us that brilliance coexists with vulnerability, that empires carry within them the seeds of fragility, and that legacy is forged through intellect and understanding as much as through force. Lucky Luciano's life continues to captivate because it is a study in human behavior, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of influence, a testament to the complex interplay between power, psychology, and consequence.